There's a line on a map that was drawn in 6 weeks by two men who had never visited the land they were dividing. That line is still killing people today. You have probably heard about conflicts in the Middle East, South Asia, or Africa and wondered why they never seem to end, why generations of people fight over the same hills, the same rivers, the same cities, why peace deals collapse, why ceasefires last days, not decades. The answer, more often than not, traces back to a single straight line, the kind of line that ignores mountains, tribes, languages, and centuries of history, and instead follows the convenience of a ruler pressed against a paper map in a colonial office thousands of miles away. This is the story of how one borderline created 100 years of war. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at a map the same way again. In 1916, two men sat down with a map of the Middle East and divided it between themselves. Sir Mark Sykes represented Britain. François-Georges Picot represented France. They were carving up territory that belonged to the Ottoman Empire, an empire they were certain would soon collapse. They drew a line from the Mediterranean coast to the border of Persia. Everything to the north went to France, everything to the south went to Britain. They finished in roughly 6 weeks. The agreement was secret. The people living in those lands were never consulted. This is what historians now call the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and it is one of the most consequential pieces of paper ever produced. It didn't just redraw a map, it planted the seeds of conflicts that are still erupting more than 100 years later. The borders it inspired created Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, nations whose boundaries cut straight through ethnic, religious, and tribal communities that had existed for centuries, lumping sworn enemies together and splitting natural allies apart. To understand why that matters, you need to understand something about how humans organize themselves. Now, for most of human history, communities were defined not by lines on maps, but by shared identity, language, religion, ancestry, trade routes. The people living in what is now northern Iraq were Kurds. They had been Kurds for thousands of years. They spoke Kurdish, they married other Kurds, they governed themselves through Kurdish tribal structures. The Sykes-Picot line didn't erase that. It just placed them inside 4 different countries: Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, turning a coherent people into 4 separate minorities overnight. That is what political scientists call an artificial state, a territory whose external borders do not match its internal identities. Scholar Jeffrey Herbst, in his landmark work on African state formation, argued that artificial borders are not merely administrative inconveniences, they are structural generators of conflict. When the state's identity and the people's identity do not align, the state must constantly use force to hold itself together, and when the force weakens, the violence that was suppressed rises. You are watching that exact process play out in real time across multiple continents. Look at Iraq. When Britain drew its borders after World War I, it created a country containing 3 groups with almost nothing in common: Sunni Arabs in the center, Shia Arabs in the south, and Kurds in the north. The only thing that ever held Iraq together was a strong man powerful enough to suppress all 3. When that strong man, Saddam Hussein, was removed in 2003, the country didn't transform into a unified democracy. It fractured almost immediately along the exact lines that Sykes and Picot had ignored in 1916. The Islamic State didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a Sunni population that felt excluded from power in a state that was never designed to include them. This is not ancient tribal hatred. This is modern political failure engineered by a border. Now look at Africa, where the same pattern was repeated on an even larger scale. In 1884 and 1885, representatives of 14 European nations gathered in Berlin for the Conference of Berlin. They divided the entire African continent among themselves. No African representatives were present. The borders they drew were almost entirely arbitrary, straight lines following latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, or rivers chosen for their convenience to European navigators, not their significance to African communities. Or, according to research published by scholars Stelios Mikalopoulos and Elias Papaioannou, approximately 40% of African borders split ethnic groups directly in half, not between groups, through them. A single ethnic community found itself split across 2 or 3 different colonial territories where territories that would later become 2 or 3 different nations with 2 or 3 different governments, languages of administration, legal systems, and economic policies. The result was not integration. The result was that people on opposite sides of the same river who spoke the same language and shared the same ancestors were suddenly foreigners to each other, but citizens of states full of people they had nothing in common with. You see the consequences in the Congo and Sudan and Nigeria, in the Central African Republic. Conflicts that the international media describe as tribal or ethnic are, in almost every case, partly conflicts about the mismatch between a colonial border and the human geography it was drawn across. But here's the part that most people miss. The problem is not just that the borders were drawn badly. The problem is that once a border exists, it becomes almost impossible to change. This is by design. One of the foundational principles of the modern international system, enshrined in the United Nations Charter and reinforced by the African Union's founding documents, is the inviolability of borders. The idea is simple. If you allow borders to be redrawn, you open the door to endless wars of conquest. Every nation that wants a neighbor's territory will claim it is simply correcting a historical injustice. The principle is not wrong. The problem is that it locks in the injustice of the original line. Political scientist uti possideris juris, literally as you possess, so you shall possess, became the legal doctrine that froze colonial borders in place when African and Asian nations gained independence in the mid-20th century. The new nations inherited the old borders, not because those borders made sense, but because the alternative, reopening every boundary to negotiation, was judged to be worse. And so the artificial state becomes a permanent feature. The mismatch becomes a permanent wound. There is a place where you can see this dynamic in its most concentrated and agonizing form: the territory of Palestine and Israel. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement placed Palestine under British control. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration promised a Jewish homeland in that same territory, while also, in the same letter, promising not to prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Both promises were made by the same government. Both could not be fully kept. The resulting collision between two peoples with legitimate historical claims to the same strip of land, shaped and sharpened by a century of colonial mismanagement, is perhaps the most studied, most debated, and most intractable conflict on Earth. Historian Eugene Rogan, in his definitive account of the modern Arab world, argues that it is impossible to understand a single current Middle Eastern conflict without understanding the colonial border decisions made between 1916 and 1922. Not as an excuse, not as a way of avoiding accountability for more recent decisions, but as the structural context that made those decisions so explosive. You cannot understand the present without understanding the line. Here's what makes this so difficult to solve. The same border that causes suffering also creates identity. The people of Iraq, for all the dysfunction of the Iraqi state, have developed an Iraqi identity over 100 years. The people of Syria call themselves Syrian. Remove or redraw the border, and you do not return to the pre-colonial world. You create a new crisis of identity and displacement. This is why the Kurdish question has never been resolved. The Kurds deserve a state by almost any reasonable principle of self-determination. But creating that state means carving territory out of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. 4 nations, 4 governments, none of whom will surrender territory voluntarily. So the Kurds remain stateless, not because the world forgot about them, but because the line drawn in 1916 was so deeply embedded into so many subsequent decisions, treaties, constitutions, and international agreements that undoing it would require undoing everything built on top of it. This is what political scientists call path dependency. The first decision, and the line, constrains every decision that follows. Each generation inherits not just a map, but the consequences of a choice they never made. And so you return to where you started. A line drawn in 6 weeks by 2 men in a London office, a line that cut through mountains and villages and families and faiths, a line that no one alive today drew, and that almost no one alive today can change. When you see a conflict on the news, when you see flags and rockets and refugee columns and politicians demanding ancient rights, look at the map. Find the straight lines, the perfectly horizontal borders, the latitudinal cuts. Those are the inherited wounds. Those are the places where someone once pressed a ruler against a paper and made a decision that would outlast empires, outlast the men who made it, and outlast every peace deal attempted since. The line is still there, and so is the war.